Good afternoon and welcome to the Full Scottish on Sunday the 7th of January. My name is Brian Liddy and I'm joined today by two guests. We have with us on my left Simon Barrow from Ecclesia and on my right Kenny Anderson. Kenny, you're an Aberdeenshire businessman and an advocate for charities promoting the awareness of cancer and support for those affected by it. Thank you for giving us part of your weekend today and welcome.
Yeah, thank you, Brian.
And Simon is the director of the Politics, Ethics and Beliefs think tank Ecclesia, and editor and author of 5 books on Scottish politics, most recently A Better Nation, The Challenges of Scottish Independence. Thank you once again, Simon, for joining us.
Always a pleasure.
So I'm sad to say that I'm going to start today's show with the Ukraine update on day 683. The Russian military is on course to lose 500,000 personnel within the next year, according to the UK Ministry of Defence. The MOD tweeted the average daily numbers of Russian casualties in Ukraine has risen by almost 300 during the course of 2023. If the numbers continue at the current rate over the next year, Russia will have lost over 500,000 personnel in Ukraine. The UK's Ministry of Defence says Russia is continuing to struggle to establish air superiority over Ukraine. 3 Russian combat jets were shot down just before Christmas, and that affected ground forces' tactical objectives later in the month, the MOD said. It added that Russia has been increasing its aerial strikes in recent days, but at a lower level than before the shootdowns. A Russian missile strike killed 11 people and injured 10 in and around the eastern Ukrainian city of Pokrovsk, the governor of the Ukrainian-controlled part of Donetsk region said. 5 of the dead were children. President Volodymyr Zelensky, in his nightly video address, said the attack quite simply targeted ordinary private homes. Denmark's transfer of 19 American-made F-16 fighter jets to Ukraine will take place in the second quarter of 2024, once Ukrainian pilots have completed training, the Defence Ministry has said. Polish farmers suspended their blockade of a major crossing into neighbouring Ukraine following the signing of an agreement with the Polish government. Truckers continue to blockade the 3 other main border crossings into Ukraine in protest at unfair competition from Ukrainian counterparts and against the relaxation of access rules to the European Union for Ukrainian firms. Reuters reports that the Kharkiv region prosecutor's office has provided further evidence that Russia attacked Ukraine with missiles supplied by North Korea, showcasing the fragments on Friday. A senior advisor to Volodymyr Zelensky said Russia hit Ukraine this week with missiles supplied by North Korea for the first time during its invasion. So that was, I would say, a relatively short, or one of the shorter updates that we've had, and I'm just wondering who to come to first. I'm just going to go alphabetically. Kenny, was there anything in today's Ukrainian update that caught your mind or that you'd like to say something on?
Just the continual depression that it's ongoing, and there doesn't seem to be any way of solving the problem. Putin presumably won't back down, and Ukraine have got to try and defend themselves. Obviously, it's out of the public eye to an extent because of the situation in Gaza, which I know we're going on to discuss. But worldwide conflicts, we need to maintain a focus on them all and see what can be done to remove them. I was listening to Christmas music, and I was listening to John and Yoko's "War Is Over," and the sentiments expressed in there from, I think it was 1973 or 74 when it was released, are exactly the same today, and that's depressing in itself. So,
thank you, Kenny. And Simon, what about yourself?
Well, again, as Kenny has said, the tragedy is that with the natural and right focus on Palestine, Israel at the moment, we're losing sight of other serious conflicts throughout the world. The Ukraine one is obviously central to that. So is Sudan, so is Yemen. There are other parts of the world where war is going on, people are being killed. And it's a massive challenge to our international institutions to try and find some resolution to this. It's sad to say that today is Orthodox Christmas Day, of course. It's Epiphany in the Western tradition. But churches throughout Russia and Ukraine will be seeking to talk about the coming of a Prince of Peace in the midst of a war. And unfortunately, certainly within the Russian Orthodox Church, there are those who are using religious language to sanction this barbarity and this killing. So that's something that needs challenging, but really there's only going to be a political solution to this, and it's not going to be an ideal one. And the sooner we can move towards it, the sooner we can stop the killing. But at the moment, there is no investment, particularly on the Putin side, towards that. So it's an unfolding tragedy.
So still no sign of any resolution in the near future. I wonder how many days our tally is going to get to for our daily updates by the time it is resolved. The next item is the situation in Gaza. I'll just start with some figures. Israel has now killed 12,040 Palestinian children in Gaza in 90 days. That's children alone, 12,040 children. Total Palestinian deaths so far is 30,676. 105 journalists are dead. 1,935,000 people have been displaced. 247,696 homes are either partially or completely destroyed. 318 schools have been damaged. 201 mosques have been damaged. 3 Christian churches have been damaged. 169 healthcare facilities, which includes 23 hospitals and 89 ambulances, have been hit, including 198 heritage sites. Those figures include numbers of people who are missing, presumed dead under rubble. Simon, as the conflict in Gaza enters the new year, with the humanitarian crisis still pressing heavily on the lives of the population of Gaza, can pressure be brought on Israel to agree a ceasefire, and what is the risk of a wider regional conflict? You mentioned Yemen in relation to Ukraine. That's 2 questions in one there, sorry.
No, that's fine. I mean, the first thing to say, of course, is it isn't a conflict in Gaza, it's a slaughter. It's a mass displacement. And it's clear that things have escalated to the stage when Netanyahu particularly, and those gathered around him, wish to have the complete removal of Palestinian people as far as possible from Gaza. The attack has extended to the West Bank. And the tragedy of the situation is that both Netanyahu and the far right in Israel and the majority faction within Hamas have ideologies of annihilation. They wish to secure their own identity, their own presence, their own future by the elimination of the other. And that's only going to lead to death. Of course, the central problem here is occupation. Without the end of occupation, there can't be an end of the conflict. And the difficulty is that in terms of pressure, it's not really just Israel, it's actually the United States, because the United States is on a daily basis sending massive amounts of arms to Israel. President Biden decided to bypass Congress, which would at least have tried to introduce some kinds of limits and conditions for the supply of those weapons. So actually pressure on the United States, particularly in an election year, is very, very important, as well as pressure on Israel, given the unpopularity of Netanyahu and the fact that really he's also trying to use war as a way of saving his own skin. So I think that's where the tiny chink of hope is possible, but without a ceasefire, nothing else is possible. And then there's a question of how to achieve a solution. Well, first of all, you're talking about massive amounts of rebuilding that would take between 5 and 10 years of whatever's left, because virtually the whole of Gaza has now been destroyed by the IDF. But in terms of a solution, a two-state solution in the way that we were talking about it in the past, particularly in relation to the small steps taken forward by the Oslo process, is now very, very difficult to achieve. Of course, the Israeli government tried to undermine the Oslo process, which wasn't going to lead to full Palestinian statehood, but was a move in that kind of direction. And they also strengthened, unfortunately, Hamas in doing that by seeking to undermine Fatah and the PLO. So there's a lot of politicking around that. But there are people in the region at the moment, from different political locations who are trying to look at how you could have maybe a single federal state with both full autonomy for Palestinians and for Israelis, or for some kind of two-state solution that overcomes the problem of the settlements, the problem of the water table, the problem of the isolation of many of the bits of territory that would create a Palestinian one. And these are long-term issues, but the immediate need is for pressure on the United States and Israel for a ceasefire.
Thank you, Simon. Kenny, is there anything that you'd like to add about the situation in Gaza?
Yeah, well, I mean, the pressure for an immediate ceasefire is essential. I mean, Simon's talking about effectively being a mass slaughter. We know the likely outcomes from other conflicts. There's going to be an increase in international terrorism. The spread to the wider geographical area, both in the Middle East and elsewhere, is inevitable. And the whole way that the state of Israel is approaching this, the government of Israel is approaching this, just doesn't seem to be through. Hamas's initial attack was obviously designed, as all terrorism often is, just to provoke the larger state into a reaction, and they've succeeded in that. And the world condemnation is there for all to see, but unfortunately within the United Nations, the UK and America seem to be unwilling to demand an immediate ceasefire, which is to get humanitarian aid in, to get help, and then to start dialogue that Simon was talking about into the possible solutions that can be brought into place. None of that can happen until there is a ceasefire. The attacks by Hamas forces in Yemen, apparently backed by Iran, on shipping and so forth, is going to have an impact. And of course, American and British naval forces are in that area, and there is a fear that an escalation will happen. And then goodness knows, I've often said everywhere, including on this programme, that politicians should be able to play chess because you can see the moves of each opponent of your opponent going ahead. And the more moves ahead of the game you can anticipate, the better able you are to deal with the immediate challenges. But our politicians don't seem to be capable of looking ahead to the outcomes. And that's like with Ukraine, that is also depressing.
Thank you, Kenny. I wonder if either of you caught the interview of Sipi Hotovely, the Israeli ambassador to the UK, earlier this week, where she seems to have said out loud the part that she's not supposed to, where she said that for them to take out Hamas, they would have to obliterate every hospital, every school, and almost every second house. And the person who was interviewing her said, but that would mean the complete annihilation of Gaza. Simon, I saw you nodding your head there. Does that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Indeed. And I mean, it's not just her, but I mean, Netanyahu and others within the Israeli government have talked about their desire to effectively eliminate the people of Gaza and the Palestinian people very openly. And yet somehow the international community is not registering this. South Africa is obviously taking the initiative towards the issue of genocide that's involved in this, which is, an absolute tragedy, because the whole situation arises from a context in which a state was created with the aim of protecting a people from a past terrible and historic genocide. So this is simply awful. But in terms of the regional conflict as well, to pick up on what Kenny said, there's likely to be some response from Hezbollah to the killing the extrajudicial killing in Lebanon, which was almost certainly carried out by Mossad. And Hamas has also been hoping that Iran will be drawn into the conflict. Of course, the real danger here is that Israel has nuclear weapons. It could be, an absolutely catastrophic situation. But I actually think many of the actors in the situation will want to hold back from that. But this is a dimension of it which we cannot ignore. And as Kenny rightly said, Western politicians in particular have to simply listen to what is being said and recognise what's going on and put enormous pressure on the withdrawal of military support for Israel, the call for an immediate ceasefire, and the escalation of talks about a long-term political solution. None of this is easy, none of it's calculable, but it has to be undertaken.
Thank you, Simon. We're out of time on this item, but you mentioned South Africa there, which I think is a reference to the ICJ.
Yes.
South Africa's taking Israel to court to the ICJ. It would be good to have more time to talk about that, but I think we have to move on. Sorry, Kenny, if that's okay.
So, yeah, no.
Okay, thank you. So the next item is 2024, which is still very young. It's today's only 7 days old. It turns out it is an election year, both internationally and here at the UK. So we're going to tackle internationally at first. So elections are going to be held in Russia and in the USA this year, while Putin is expected to be returned as president with no serious opposition. In the US, it's a bit more complicated. It seems that democracy is on trial as Trump appeals to the Supreme Court over being ruled as unfit to run for president in Colorado and Maine. That's despite 91 indictments. And he's also leading President Biden in the polls. Just a little bit about that. Colorado and Maine. The US, that's to do with the US Supreme Court, is to hear an appeal of Colorado ruling they've removed Trump from the state ballot by using the Fourth Amendment to the US Constitution, which inciting an insurrection. And that's going to be argued in early February. The 14th Amendment was approved after the Civil War, meant to bar from office supporters of the rebel Confederate states, but it's rarely been used. And the 14th Amendment challenges Trump in other states. Amendments in other states to Trump have either failed or remain undecided. Kenny, I don't know, do you follow American politics closely? Have you got anything to say about internationally this election year?
Excuse me. I do follow American politics, and there's a risk, obviously, if this it's now going to the Supreme Court for the US, and I think Colorado have set aside the blocking of Trump until the outcome of the Supreme Court ruling. So at the moment, I think his name will be going forward for the primaries, but the Supreme Court ruling will decide that. I suppose, I know it'll be in strictly legal terms, but the danger, if Trump is banned from standing, is that could actually create unrest within his base. And as we saw in the attack on the Capitol, a large part of that base is verging on the lunatic. So I think there is a threat to democracy in America, and I'm not really sure how it's going to play out. It seems surprising that there aren't more dynamic candidates available to the Americans. I mean, Biden doesn't strike as a figure of power and control. He looks exactly what he is, an aging man. And the fear is that Trump gets back in and he'll be even more vindictive than he was in his last presidency if he becomes president. So that's a serious worry. As far as the elections worldwide are concerned, obviously Russia, it's questionable whether that's proper democracy in action. But again in the UK, we're seeing a Westminster election that's going to be basically decided by probably 150 seats in Middle England, which again questions the way our democracy works in the UK. So lots of questions, very few answers.
Thank you, Kenny. Simon, I suppose the question is, do you think these two elections in the States and in Russia, is it going to affect peace and stability in the world?
Well, of course, both of them are going to have major impact. I mean, in terms of the climate catastrophe we face, the American election is going to be absolutely critical. As far as Russia is concerned, you're right, President Putin is going to win the presidency, mainly because he's managed to suppress or eliminate much of the opposition. And so one of the tasks I think we have is to support the opposition emerging from the grassroots, including the non-violent opposition to the war that is taking place. But of course, people are being rounded up and imprisoned when they do that. So that's a grim situation. In terms of the United States, I live in an Anglo-American household, so we're following American politics probably obsessively closely at the moment. The Supreme Court is unlikely to resolve things quite in the way that many people are hoping, I think, because although it's been stacked by Trump, of course, very much in his direction, I think they'll be extremely reluctant to try and enter into discussion of the politics of it. In terms of the 14th Amendment, it's pretty clear, actually, but what they'll be able to say is that there are a whole range of criminal trials connected to the charges of insurrection, which won't be resolved at the moment. So they're not going to be able to come down with a definitive judgment, even if they want to. But I think they'll do everything they can in their power to find other ways of keeping Trump on the ballot. And of course, there's an argument amongst those who are deeply opposed to Trump as to whether the best way to see his defeat is to keep him off the ballot. There might be legitimate reasons for doing that, but that will indeed anger millions of people in America, or whether it's to defeat him politically. And as Kenny has said, the real problem here is that Trump is actually leading in the polls. A generic Democrat would lead Trump, but then generic candidates always do because they don't have specific traits that people are for or against. But Biden is almost certain to run, short of some medical incident interfering with that. And there is, I think, a real danger of Trump getting back. And already, it's not just about Trump, it's about the extremism that he has created around him, really, and has become a figurehead for, including the manifesto that's being created, which is really the evisceration of a neutral state and its replacement with far-right ideologues in civil service positions, the de-gutting of institutions of protection. It is a real threat to democracy. But of course, what Trump is doing is using his almost fascistic rallies to characterize the situation in exactly the opposite way. He's talking about Joe Biden as a threat to democracy because he still, of course, is peddling the lie, as are thousands, if not millions, of his supporters, that the last election was stolen. So it's a really critical situation. And it's, I think that the real issue when it comes to November is going to be the danger that some people disillusioned with the whole political process and not really perceiving the threat to democracy stay away from the polls. It's important that young people vote, that black people and minorities vote, that people in apparently safe democratic areas vote. But it's a pretty grim choice between Trump and Biden, but that's where we are, and it's absolutely vital that Trump is stopped.
Thank you, Simon. So I think we'll move on then to 2024 being an election year here in the UK. So it's Rishi Sunak stole Sir Keir Starmer's thunder this week when he said that he expected the UK's general election would be in the autumn this year, with a spring budget due on March 6th. Is there still a chance of an election in May if there is a favourable media and polling response to the budget? I suppose essentially here the question is, Sunak, who recently met with Dominic Cummings just before he let slip that the general election would take place in the second half of the year. Everybody was thinking that it was going to be a May election. If he was to go early and have the election in May, it would look decisive. But if he was to go late, he would just be crossing his fingers and hope that something comes up. And I can't remember who I went first with last time. You're both smiling at me. And who did I go first with the last time? Can you remind me?
I think it was myself. So Simon, fire away.
Okay, so Simon, over to you. General election UK 2024.
Okay, well, I mean, the first thing is Sunak was pretty clever because he didn't actually say he was expecting an election. He said it was his working assumption, which means absolutely everything and nothing. Now, there are a number of factors involved in this. One is that if there is an early election, he won't even have lasted 2 years as unelected Prime Minister. So I suspect there's part of him that would like to be able to say that at least he's got to 2 years, because let's face it, he's not expecting to win. On the other hand, I think there's also a game being played here because he would like to catch the opposition out as unawares as he possibly can, because the polls are heading in a completely different direction. So I think there will be a pragmatic decision as to when the election is held. We'll get an early election if there's a giveaway in the spring budget and there's some way in which the polls can move in a slightly different direction. But by talking about later in the year, I think he's probably hoping that his opponents will take their foot off the gas, so to speak, and allow him more time for manoeuvre. So it's anyone's game and anyone's guess, really. But it's not looking at all good for him, though whether Keir Starmer as an alternative will be much of a radical alternative is very much open to question, because almost everything he originally pledged to do when he was elected leader of the Labour Party, he's decided he's not going to do. And there barely a day seems to pass when he isn't trimming his sails according to the way that the Tories are framing things. So it's not looking good for the outcome, whoever wins. Though I must admit, I'm hoping that there can be some kind of hung parliament, because obviously I want to see the Tories out, and obviously Labour is going to lead some kind of government in the future, but I don't think they should be left simply to their own devices. It would be a tragedy, for example, if the Greens lost their seat in Brighton and their foothold in the House. I hope, in fact, they extend it. What we need is a kind of plural cooperative politics, particularly on the progressive side. And at the moment, the Westminster system is so stacked against that and towards the monopoly of two parties that are increasingly sclerotic and uncreative. So it's not a very good looking situation. But as to when the election will be, we simply don't know. It will be an opportunistic decision taken probably fairly short range when it comes to it. Could go to the end of the year, could happen much sooner.
Good use of the word sclerotic there. I think the latest that the election could actually happen is actually January 2025. So there's even a chance that it could hold off until then. And so many things that you said there made me want to. So there's 3 by-elections coming up,
Yes.
which might make Sunak go for an early election, because if he gets battered in the by-elections, then it's going to be brutal when he goes into the general election. I will come to you, Kenny, I promise. Haven't forgotten that you're there. And there's also the Bank of England say that inflation's going to be coming down, which might be a good time to go later rather than sooner. As you mentioned Starmer, I saw my first use of the word Starmerism, I think, over the weekend. I don't know if anybody else has seen one before that. But Kenny, and we definitely need to talk about a hung parliament before we leave this. Kenny, is there anything that you want to say in relation to 2024 UK?
I mean, I think the Tories will be looking all the time at the polls, any movement that they can maximise on. I think they'll be maximising their dirty tricks department in the hope that they can throw something at Labour. I mean, the spring budget is obviously going to be a giveaway, which is going to cause 1 or 2 problems, I believe, in terms of the divergence between the Scottish taxation and the English taxation, because they're going to give away so much in that spring budget. I think if I was a betting man, I think he's going to spring a surprise and go for a May or June election, but that's just my speculation. At the moment, the polls would indicate it's not going to be a hung parliament, but traditionally, I think when push comes to shove, the Tory vote becomes more steady. I'm slightly surprised that nobody's been attacking Ed Davey, the Liberal leader, because he was Postmaster General, I believe, during the Post Office, the widely publicised now Post Office disgraceful tragedy that happened to all these postmasters. Ed Davey refused to meet Alan Bates. I think if I was facing a challenge from the Liberals in a constituency, I'd be having a right go at Ed Davey about that. So there's a lot of things that I think will crop up in that last run-in. I don't think it's impossible that Sunak will wait until January 2025. I think he'll want to have as much influence as he possibly can and have as long a tenure as possible. This 2-year aspect has been written about in today's papers, and I think it's probably a key thing. And the legacy of Liz Truss's, however many days it was, 39 or 43, I can't remember. I think he sees that, and he won't want to be listed as the worst Prime Minister. So he wants to get ahead of Truss, Johnston, and probably Theresa May as well. See what happens.
Thanks, Kenny. Yeah, I'm sure that Theresa May will be very strong in Sunak's mind at the moment when that disastrous snap election that she called in 2017, which didn't turn out very well for them at all. I'm really keen to talk about, Simon, you mentioned a hung parliament. Everybody seems to be certain that Keir Starmer is going to be the next Prime Minister, and that the Tories are going to get sort of just annihilated in the general election, but it's how strong a win can it be for Starmer? And of course then, if he does have to enter into a hung parliament, he's got the option of either going with the SNP or the Liberals. Do you agree? Do you think that he would be more likely even to for there to be a Labour Conservative hung parliament than a Labour SNP one?
Well, I mean, first of all, as Kenny has rightly said, the polls are indicating a very clear victory for Labour at the election at the moment. But in practice, it may be quite a bit closer than that. I think a hung parliament is an outside chance. As I say, it would be something I'd hope for, if only because it forces some level of cooperation. Starmer has made it very clear that he will seek to ignore the SNP in any way that he can. And obviously the SNP, I think, needs to be very clear that it will not in any sense prop up a Conservative government. But he's going to have to do deals if that situation emerges. What kind of deals, it's difficult to say at the moment. Just as it's difficult to say, Kenny made the point about he'd have a little bit of a tendency to have a bet on an early election. I think I would as well. I think the element of surprise is one that Sunak will try. But on the other hand, if things aren't in any way looking like it will open a door for them, they'll just keep going as long as possible, hoping something that will turn up. So it's all very uncertain, but really the whole political system that we're dealing with is a very, very broken one. First past the post, excludes choice, encourages monopoly, discourages cooperation. And that's a really terrible thing. And really, it's a change of system that we need, not just a change of government.
Yes, first past the post and proportional representation and all of that. Kenny, what do you think about the chances of, or what do you think the outcome would be if it were to be a minority Labour government who then went to the SNP for support? Alan Smith in the National said that he thinks that would be the best outcome in a UK election. And he said that what the SNP would get out of it would be they would ask for the permanent devolution to Scotland for the power to hold a binding referendum on independence in time for the Holyrood election in 2026. But do you think Labour would work with the SNP?
No, I think they would do all that they possibly could to avoid working with the SNP. If we get a hung parliament, I still think it's unlikely at this time that that's going to happen. And the circumstances for it to arise are almost peculiar. I also suspect that if Labour were not to get an overall majority, then they would look to manage the country on a minority basis, on a item by item, policy by policy basis, and try to show the UK voting electorate that they can be trusted. And then they would do what Harold Wilson did in 1974 and jump for another election 6 months later, if the polls were looking good for them. But I think that is the most likely scenario. If there's a hung parliament, Labour would manage it and then go for a quick election within 6 to 9 months.
Okay, thanks, Kenny. I'd like to take a minute or two to talk about the Reform Party, which started out as the Brexit Party, I think, with Farage. it's Mr. Case, I think, is leading that party now, and he says that they're going to put up a candidate in every single seat in the country, including the whole of Scotland. A lot of people are saying that that's going to split the Unionist vote, or certainly the Tory vote. Is that how do you think that would work out, Simon? And if when they do stand in every single seat in Scotland, what's the outcome going to be?
Well, standing in a seat is one thing. Actually, getting votes is another thing, etc. I at the moment have a sense that the Reform Party has sort of shot its bolt, really, but it's clearly going to try and make an intervention. It will have an impact in some areas. Again, difficult to calculate. I think the bigger issue around that is the growth of what we previously would have clearly called the far right within British politics. But that's also happening, of course, within the Conservative Party. To a large extent, the Conservative Party is UKIP these days, and many One Nation and moderate Conservatives have been forced out. And the danger actually is that the Conservative Party itself will swing further to the right. And certainly the reason Reform are trying to do it is that they want to encourage that kind of trend, just as UKIP, although ironically denied by the inequity of the first past the post system from gaining seats, nevertheless effectively got their policy aims implemented by a Conservative government. So the takeover of the Conservative Party by some very hard right figures is a real concern, and I think we should read what Reform is seeking to do in that light. In terms of their actual electoral impact, I suspect it will be less than some people will be expecting, but it's very difficult to calculate.
Thank you, Simon. And so, Kenny, do you think with Reform standing in every seat in the country, is there going to be lots of lost deposits?
I think if they did stand in every seat, there would be lost deposits, and I think they would get a very, very low vote. But I wouldn't trust this guy Case as far as I could throw him any more than I would trust Farage. And I think there's a bit of political gamesmanship going on that Simon's hinting at as well, that they're trying to push the narrative and the Conservatives towards the right. So I wouldn't, for example, I wouldn't be surprised if just before they had to decide that they suddenly went, well, the following Conservative MPs we are willing to support in exchange for them not standing. And I could see that working in the Conservatives' favour in some of the seats that they hold. I'm looking at West Aberdeenshire, for example, a Reform candidate in West Aberdeenshire, where I'm speaking from and live. I don't think would get more than a few votes. And I think it will come down to a Tory versus SNP split as it did in 2019. So the relevance of Reform, once again, the media seem to be allowing Reform, as they did with Farage, to showcase something way beyond their electoral support. And that just seems strange to me.
Thank you, Kenny. So we'll move on to the next item, which is Scotland's economy. Tomorrow, in a speech at the University of Glasgow, the First Minister, Humza Yousaf, will set out the foundation for an industrial policy in an independent Scotland in the first of a series of economic speeches. The First Minister is expected to say that the UK economy has failed Scotland and the UK-based political parties offer no alternatives to the failed Westminster economic model. In his speech, he's going to be quoting a report by the Resolution Foundation, which concluded that if the UK had the average income and inequality of similar countries, then the typical household would be £8,300 better off. He's looking at the press release here, said if we use the same analysis for countries that are similar to Scotland, such as Denmark, Ireland and Finland, the difference for the typical Scottish household would be even greater. They would be £10,200 better off. It's quite a detailed report, and I really shouldn't probably concentrate on just those figures so much. And again, I've forgotten who I came to first the last time. Kenny, it's you this time, isn't it? Have you had a chance to look into what's going to happen tomorrow, or maybe the Resolution Foundation report?
I haven't seen the Resolution Foundation report, but I was reading some articles this morning about what Humza Yousaf is setting out. I mean, the history of my support for independence has always been based on a successful economy with as close to full employment as is possible across all parts of Scotland, with decentralisation, rural areas benefiting from resources on their doorstep. I truly believe that the Danish, Finnish, Irish model is extremely good. I mean, I've been to Norway quite a few times and I've seen the money that they've used to industries, for example, window manufacture and door manufacturer, to be established in rural areas and create proper businesses that are successful. I mean, the Irish model, I know it's low corporation tax, it's 12.5%. I can't remember if it's based on turnover or employee numbers, but the larger corporations are going up to the internationally agreed 15% corporation tax. But of course, that hides the fact that all those employees are going to be paying income tax and the equivalent of national insurance. So I believe the economy, the industrial economy, the service economy, all aspects of the Scottish economy need to be encouraged in every way possible. And that is the way forward to demonstrate how an independent Scotland will operate. So I'm quite excited about what Holmes has got to say. He's, so far, in my opinion, he's putting business and commerce and industry at a higher level of focus than perhaps existed under the previous First Minister. And I think the relationship with business and industry and commerce is critical. So I'm excited. I think the way to deliver independence is to have a strong industrial and business proposition, which people will get behind. And you increase the tax base, you increase public services as a result, and you go forward successfully.
Thank you, Kenny. I don't think I maybe laid out the report very well, but certainly it's about productivity. And I think when people talk about increased productivity, they think, oh, do you just want me to work more hours or work harder during the hours that I do work? But that's not the case. It's about infrastructure and how easily can your products get to the market, which means road, rail, sea and air, and then also just how easy is it or difficult is it for people to get to work in the morning, public transport, again, road and rail. And certainly the First Minister, I think, he's not just going to be talking about how much better off we'd be financially or just even industrial infrastructure. He's going to be bringing in a well-being economy. And one of the things, Simon, I promise I'll let you speak, that the report said, it talks about the UK's toxic combination of low growth and high inequality. Challenges facing the UK include Brexit and the move to net zero transition. Renewal of our economic strategy is required but not on offer. Serious about getting inequality down as we are about getting growth up. Tax and benefit systems that are fair. Structural changes that, far from speeding up, has slowed down. And the one that struck me was that they argue that a return to prosperity requires a fundamental shift, investing in our future rather than living off our past. So, Simon, was there anything in there that you would maybe want to say something about?
Well, yes. I mean, if you look, first of all, at the underperformance of the UK economy as a whole, that's come about as a range of a number of factors. One of them is chronic underinvestment, actually, particularly when interest rates were low or virtually non-existent at all. The opportunity to invest was not taken. Secondly, bailouts and public money going to exactly the wrong people instead of investment in the future and in public services going to the rich and the banks and so on. And, you know, also the political dysfunction of the whole system. There's much we could say about that, but let's focus on Scotland. And it's very, very good that Humza Yousaf is going to be launching what he's called the foundations of an industrial policy. Now, I have to declare a bit of an interest here because through my think tank Ecclesia, I work on a cross and non-party basis, but I am actually the National Secretary of the SNP's trade union group. So I have a little bit of a dog in this race, if you could say. And for a long time, we've been saying that it's really vital that Scotland has a joined up industrial policy that's also a green industrial policy, addressing the fundamental economic question for Scotland's future, which is how to achieve a just transition from oil and gas and fossil fuels to a green, sustainable economy. We have absolutely massive renewables potential, both onshore and offshore. There are lots of debates about the extent of those and how they can be realised, but they all require considerable investment. So we need a strategy which joins industrial policy and, as Kenny's saying, support for business with that green transition, and also with the elimination of poverty and inequality, because actually creating greater inequality and levelling up within society is also about increasing the tax base, is also about improving wages and conditions and the living standards of ordinary people in Scotland. So we need that renewal programme. The important thing is to be able to specify what can be achieved with the powers that we have at the moment under devolution, and what requires the additional powers that can come with independence and a further transfer of powers from Westminster. And I wish every time the Scottish Government actually did a budget, it also set out the different kinds of decisions that it could take under independence, the costs involved as well as the opportunities there. I think that's really, really important. And I hope that the way in which it's framed by the First Minister tomorrow will actually involve people and encourage a debate about the steps that need to be taken in the future. And for example, the STUC has just published a very important report called Raising Tax to Deliver for Scotland. Now, I don't think you can build a new Scotland simply on taxation, but there are different decisions that have been taken and can be taken. And what the STUC is saying is that there are decisions that could produce an additional 1.1 billion for Scotland's public services. And longer term, they're looking at the case for introducing wealth taxes, replacing the council tax with a proportional property tax, or I would like to say land value tax, though that's a longer term issue, introducing a super tax on private jets, amongst other measures. And they suggest that that could raise an additional 2.6 billion a year for Scottish public finances and investment. Now, there's a lot of argument to be had about the details of that, the role of taxation within the broader economic strategy, but these are the kind of conversations we need to get into, and Kenny is absolutely right. An offer for independence, and we need a renewed offer for independence, has to have a solid economic base and case for it.
Thank you, Simon. You mentioned the framing of how is this going to be done tomorrow. We've got more quotes from what the First Minister is going to say, and to me it kind of sounds like this is, as well as announcing this report, it sounds like a start of an election campaign. See if you agree. He's going to say both Labour and the Conservatives agree that the UK should be out of the EU and the huge European single market, and they both want to cut inward migration. Those are just two examples which demonstrate that the two main UK parties, Westminster political interests, will always override Scottish economic interests. So, Kenny, does that sound to you as much like the start of an election campaign to you?
I think so. I think it's an election strategy, and I mean the question of immigration is really crucial to Scotland, and we all know that immigrants, somebody that moves themselves from their home country and comes to a new country, they're energetic, they're imaginative, they want to make life better for themselves and their families and their loved ones. So immigration as part of a business strategy is crucial. I mean, I was in construction from 1976 until 2018, and I saw huge changes in productivity and efficiencies. But by about 2008, 2009, that started flatlining, and there was the development of management contractors, and it's a business model that I don't think works well in any industry. SMEs are very, very important. Training, taking on apprentices, using local labour, using local resources, being invested in the local community. SMEs do all of these things. I mean, I'm drifting into other areas a moment, but I mean, we've seen the problems with procurement on the A9 because there are just a very small number of huge contractors that can take on parts of the A9. Whereas if you go back 20 years, there would have been 10 or 15. So I think part of the strategy has got to be to build the base, not to be dependent on a few very large employers. And the efficiency and productivity will come from training, education, looking at how things are done and improvements to them. But yes, I think to answer the question directly, I think this is the start of Whom's are beginning to stamp on the Scottish National Party, his vision for how we make independence a reality.
Thank you, Kenny. And a couple more things just from that report. I've tried to get through as much of it as I could before coming on the show. To talk about the toxic combination of low growth and high inequality and stalled progress. 9 million young workers have never worked in an economy with sustained average wage rises. But Simon, it's something that you said. There were a couple of things in the report where I think Scotland is already doing that. They said that the UK needs a progressive tax system as well as an overhaul of the benefit system to make it more humanitarian. And I think we've already got the start of that here in Scotland. Do you agree?
Well, yes, I mean, I do. And I mean, I mentioned specifically the STUC tax research. It's actually the second report they've produced in 2 years. And, I think there's dialogue going on with the Scottish Government about moving the tax system in a more progressive direction. Unfortunately, the idea of freezing council tax is not a progressive move, and one that I think is a misuse of resources, really. It's clearly an electoral gamble. And you said a few moments ago, was this the sort of start of an election campaign? Obviously it is, to an extent, and the chief task that Humza Yousaf and the SNP have got to achieve in the election is actually to challenge Labour. Labour is going to be the main threat to the SNP in Scotland, and there's an opportunity to move into territory that Labour has abandoned in terms of progressive taxation, in terms of investment, and in terms of a joined-up industrial strategy. So I think that's clearly the direction in which he's seeking to move. In terms of social security, a lot of very good work has been done in starting up the social security system in Scotland based on human dignity, human rights, and accountability. Everything that doesn't happen under the DWP in the Westminster system. Of course, we still have a small percentage of benefits being distributed in Scotland, and those powers need to be extended. But it's a massive task setting up these agencies and making the system work. And there have been some delays, but there's also been a good start there. And clearly we need to be charting a different kind of direction, a Northern European kind of economy, rather than a kind of neoliberal Westminster economy, is the direction that we want to head in. And that involves transition, and that involves decisions about specific economic areas, including, of course, taxation, social security, industrial strategy, and as I've mentioned, the key big framing issue, which is just transition.
Thank you, Simon. So the last question that I've got for you today, I think is for all three of us. I don't know what order we're going to maybe tackle this in, but it simply is, what are your hopes for 2024? Can I maybe kick off just to get mine out of the way? I think the obvious one would obviously be peace in Ukraine and in Israel and Gaza, but and the voice in my ear is saying maybe money for broadcast in Scotland so that we can get more shows off the ground. But I've sort of tried to think about something maybe just not as obvious as that or glib as that. I'll leave them to both of you. And my mind went back to during the pandemic and the lockdowns and the virus, when everybody said everything's going to change now. People like refuse collectors are now going to be valued more than bankers and businessmen. Frontline workers in the NHS are going to be valued properly and given proper wages. And it just seems that since then, we just really quickly just went back to the way we've always been. And I think I would like maybe more people to kind of remember how we wanted things to change post-pandemic. And so maybe I'd just like to see some of that come back this year. I'm going to go alphabetical now again. So Kenny, what would you like for 2024?
Well, I mentioned John Lennon previously, so I suppose peace, love and kindness, but that's all a bit glib. When you're talking about equality, somebody said that, I think it was either the 5th or the 6th of January, the top echelons of UK business will have earned by the 5th or 6th of January the average salary for a whole year of the average worker in the UK. And that's an obscenity which I think needs to be corrected. And I think steps have been taken in Scotland to hope that. But yeah, optimism internationally, locally, and very selfishly in West Aberdeenshire, I would like us to have a UMP who supports independence and doesn't just be a lapdog to a Prime Minister in Westminster.
Thank you, Kenny. Simon?
Well, indeed. I mean, obviously, I would like to see the defeat of Trump and the defeat of the Tories at Westminster. And you mentioned the whole question of back to normal after the pandemic. In fact, somewhere in front of me, I have a copy of a book called Scotland After the Virus, which Jerry Hassan and I put together in 2020, which was poems and prose, but also looking at public policy issues and the kind of changes we need to make. And we haven't addressed that issue. So I think somehow beyond elections, we need to get back into that. And in terms of peace and progress and understanding, I think, obviously that's all about politics, but it's also about the human heart and about the kind of change we need to make in the way that we live. And I'm going to express my hopes for 2024 in a very short poem. To punt my own work, I have a collection called Beyond Our Means coming out, hopefully not far into this new year. And one of them is called Unwounding. And it particularly was written in relation to the Palestine-Israel crisis at the moment. Imagine what would become possible if we could but gaze on the wounds of the other and recognize in them our fellow fractured lives and likenesses. Imagine what would become possible if we could but see our petrified enemies as lost and longing kindred souls on a painful path to siblinghood. And imagine what would become possible if we could but turn ourselves aside from the vast and veiling illusion that vengeance ever rights wrongs. And that might sound kind of optimistic, but without that scale of change in the human heart as well as human politics, we aren't going to achieve peace. And John Lennon's song is going to go on being sung into a void. But I do think that kind of change is possible. It's a kind of wake-up call we need. As I say, this is the season of epiphany, and that's about seeing things anew and waking up. And I think that's really what my hope is for 2024.
Thank you, Simon. And yeah, that does chime very nicely with John Lennon and what you were saying, Kenny. And you mentioned Epiphany. I don't know if you've noticed, but there's already Easter eggs in the shops. And I did see some comment go by which said it seems such a shame that it's only just the 25th of December since Christ was born, and they're already talking about his death, and it's only. But sorry, maybe that's a bit. But anyway, that's the end of the show. Thank you, Kenny. Thank you, Simon, for giving up again a good chunk of your weekends. I'll let you get back to them again. But thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Good to be with you.
Thank you. So that's it for this week's Full Scottish, but before we go, I just want to remind you that here at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. So to everyone who has donated and to everyone who has signed up to make a regular payment, we thank you very much. We now urgently need to raise at least £10,000 to pay our bills within the next 7 days. We have already raised almost £2,000 thanks to your generosity. However, we do need to raise the remaining £8,000 immediately if we are to be able to pay our bills and continue making programmes like this one. So please do donate whatever you can afford. We promise that our programmes will always be free to view. So if you can afford, say, £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. Thank you once again to Simon and to Kenny, our guest today. It's goodbye from me, and we'll let you get on with your weekends. Goodbye.